Every now and then a news story comes along that's so shocking, you just have to look deeper, beyond the headlines. Today we're going to look at one of those tragedies to try and understand a really disturbing pattern of violence that sadly happens far too often, hidden away from view.
So, our story starts with this absolutely grim discovery in Pune, India. It was October 2023, and people near a bridge on the Baramati-Bigwan Road started noticing a horrible smell. What the police found when they investigated was a tragedy that would unravel a whole story of betrayal and unbelievable violence.
Okay, this timeline is just critical to understanding what happened. On October 12, Deepali Jadhav is killed. But then, just 2 days later, her husband goes and files a missing person report. A calculated, cold act of deception. It then took another 8 days for her body to even be found, and 4 more after that before her killer was finally arrested.
So, the big question is, how did the police connect the dots? How did they go from finding an unidentified body to getting a confession from the victim's own husband? Well, the details of the investigation are both really clever and absolutely heartbreaking.
At first, police really didn't have much to go on. But the crucial clue, the thing that broke the case open, was a tattoo on the victim's hand that said Ravi Raj. This name led them to a missing persons report filed by a man named Sudarshan Jadhav, who, it turns out, also went by the alias Ravi Raj. Once they started questioning him, his story completely fell apart, and he confessed to killing his wife, who was 8 months pregnant, during a rage-filled fight over suspected infidelity.
The details of this one case are just horrific. But it really forces us to ask a much bigger, much more difficult question. As shocking as this one story is, how common is this kind of violence really?
So to figure out if this was just a one-off incident, we need to zoom out and look at the whole national picture. And it turns out, researchers in India have been studying this exact issue for a while now, trying to identify trends, patterns, and what triggers this kind of violence.
And this isn't just based on anecdotes. There's a serious academic effort to make sense of these tragedies. This review, for instance, pulled together data from over a 15-year period to find the common threads that lead to these fatal outcomes.
Turns out, there's an official term for this kind of crime: intimate partner homicide, or IPH. The research defines it as the most extreme and tragic form of domestic violence. And giving it a specific category like this really helps researchers and policymakers dig into its root causes much more effectively.
And here's where it gets truly chilling. The motive that Sudarshan Jadhav confessed to, that suspicion of infidelity, is tragically common. The systematic review found it's one of the leading triggers for this crime in India, right alongside things like dowry conflicts, financial stress, and escalating abuse. This pretty much confirms that Deepali Jadhav's murder wasn't some random anomaly. It was part of a recognized and devastating pattern.
So this brings us right to the heart of the issue. Why does this happen? To really understand the act, we have to try to understand the perpetrator. And a study on men who commit domestic violence gives us some deeply, deeply unsettling insights.
Now, it's really important to note that this study was done in Pune, the very same area where Deepali was killed. It looked at the psychosocial profiles of 50 men who were perpetrators of domestic violence, trying to figure out what factors were contributing to their awful behavior.
Okay, the first finding is just staggering. A massive 77%, almost 8 out of 10, of the men in the study were diagnosed with alcohol dependence. This shows an incredibly powerful link between substance abuse and severe violence against the partner.
But it's not just about substance abuse. Another huge piece of the puzzle is childhood trauma. The men in this study reported on average 4 different adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These are deeply traumatic events from childhood, things like abuse, neglect, or just growing up in a really dysfunctional home.
And look at the 2 most common childhood experiences they reported: having substance abuse in their family and witnessing verbal or psychological abuse between their parents. It suggests that the environment these men grew up in was often just saturated with the very same problems they would later inflict on others.
The study also categorized the violence into 2 types. What they called simple violence included things like slapping or kicking, but complicated violence was much more severe, involving the use of a weapon or an object. And this distinction becomes absolutely critical when we look at the next piece of data.
This right here, this is where it all clicks into place. The data shows this stark, undeniable connection.
Of the men who witnessed that severe, complicated violence between their parents as kids, a shocking 66%, 2/3 of them, went on to commit that exact same type of violence as adults. This is powerful, powerful evidence that violence is, in so many ways, a learned behavior.
All right, so let's pull all these threads together. We've seen a single tragic case, we've looked at the bigger national context, and we've dug into the psychological roots. Now let's connect these pieces to see the full, terrible pathway from childhood trauma to adult violence.
The research paints a clear but tragic picture. Being exposed to trauma in childhood is a massive risk factor for developing problems like alcohol dependence or depression later in life, and those conditions, in turn, are strongly connected with someone perpetrating severe domestic violence.
And this quote from a study on the topic just says it all, doesn't it? It confirms this idea of an intergenerational transmission of violence. The abuse seen in one generation creates an extremely high risk of that same abuse being repeated in the next.
So you see, this isn't random. It's a clear cycle of risk. It starts with those adverse childhood experiences. That exposure can then lead to adult issues like alcohol dependence, which then dramatically increases the risk that a person will commit extreme violence against their partner.
Understanding this cycle, from trauma to tragedy, is the first crucial step, but it leaves us with the most important and difficult question of all. Now that we can see the pattern so clearly, what on earth does it take to actually break it?